Just after midnight on September 26, 1983, a Soviet colonel picked up a telephone and reported that the United States had launched a nuclear first strike, and unlike in our world, no one paused to doubt him. The warning was false, a trick of sunlight on high clouds, but by the autumn of 1983, the men who ran the Soviet Union had spent 2 years preparing to believe exactly this message. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. To understand how a reflection nearly ended the world, you have to understand the year it happened. In March 1983, Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and 2 weeks later announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile shield Moscow read as preparation to strike first and absorb the reply. Since 1981, the KGB's Operation Ryan had ordered its residencies across the globe to hunt for signs of an imminent NATO attack, a program championed personally by Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chairman now serving as General Secretary, gravely ill with kidney failure and increasingly ruling from a suite in the Central Clinical Hospital. Then, on September 1st, a Soviet Su-15 interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 near Sakhalin, killing all 269 people aboard, including a sitting American congressman. Relations between the superpowers reached their lowest point in 20 years, and in November, NATO's Pershing II missiles were due in West Germany, weapons whose short flight time, Moscow believed, could decapitate the Soviet leadership in under 10 minutes. The system was primed. All it needed was a signal. But what no one in either capital understood that September, what would not become clear until it was far too late, was how little room the system had left for a single human doubt. At approximately 00:15 Moscow time on September 26, the Oko early warning satellites reported a missile launch from the direction of Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Then a second. Then 3 more. 5 Minuteman ICBMs, the screen said, rising toward the Soviet Union. In the bunker at Serpukhov 15 south of Moscow, sirens sounded and a red panel lit with a single word: launch. The alarm was a phantom. Near the autumn equinox, the geometry of sun, satellite, and atmosphere aligned so that sunlight glinting off high-altitude clouds mimicked the infrared bloom of missile plumes. In our timeline, the duty officer that night was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a software engineer by training who distrusted the new system, reasoned that a real first strike would come as hundreds of missiles rather than 5, noted that ground radars saw nothing, and reported a malfunction. In this timeline, Petrov is not in the chair. The colonel on duty is a different kind of officer, not a fool and not a fanatic, but a disciplined man trained to trust his instruments and follow his checklist. The checklist said the computer's confidence was highest. The checklist said report. He reported. Within minutes, the words confirmed missile attack were moving up the chain of command, and the most dangerous night of the Cold War had begun. The report climbed through the night like a fuse burning. General Yuri Votintsev, commander of the Missile Space Defense Forces, was woken first and heard the words every officer of his generation had rehearsed and dreaded. He passed them upward. Chief of the General Staff Nikolai Ogarkov was pulled from sleep. Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov after him. The Kazbek command network came alive, linking the General Staff to the political leadership, and the new Chegit command briefcases, only just entering service, were opened for the first time in anger. Then came the call that mattered most, to the Central Clinical Hospital, where Andropov lay tethered to a dialysis machine, running a superpower from a sickbed. For 2 years, he had told his intelligence services that the Americans might be preparing exactly this. Now his own satellites were telling him it had come. 5 missiles made a strange kind of sense to a mind steeped in Ryan's logic. Not a full strike, but the leading edge of one, a precursor aimed at the leadership itself, timed ahead of the Pershing deployment, launched in the American afternoon of September 25th, while Moscow slept. The men on the line were not madmen. They were tired, frightened, rational men inside a doctrine that had been built deliberately to leave them almost no time to think. The consequences of that doctrine were about to become clear. But first, the horizon itself would offer one last chance to stop. Soviet procedure required that satellite warnings be corroborated by ground radar, the Donetsk and Dnieper stations ringing the country's periphery. But those radars could only see incoming warheads once they rose above the horizon, roughly halfway through a 30-minute flight, and as the minutes passed, the radars saw nothing. No tracks, no warheads, an empty sky. Ogarkov seized on the silence. The custodian of launch procedure argued that the absence of radar confirmation meant the satellites were wrong, that 5 missiles and an empty horizon added up to a malfunction, not a war. Ustinov countered with the cold arithmetic of the age. If they waited for the radars, they would be waiting until Moscow had only minutes left. If the attack was real, hesitation meant the death of the state and the loss of any ability to reply. This was launch on warning, stripped to its essence, a choice between trusting a machine and gambling the country. From his hospital bed, weighing 5 glowing tracks against an empty screen, Andropov chose the machine. He authorized retaliation before the window closed. The order began to move. What happened next turned on seconds. As the launch order propagated to the strategic rocket forces, the phantom tracks on the Oko screens began to fade, the sun's angle shifting, the illusion dissolving exactly as it had appeared. At Serpukhov 15, the duty colonel watched his confirmed attack simply vanish and understood, in a single terrible moment, what his checklist had set in motion. Word flashed to the general staff. Ogarkov, who had argued for doubt all along, transmitted a frantic countermand on his own authority, flooding every channel he had. Most of the rocket armies stood down. Regiments caught mid-sequence froze in their silos. But 2 regiments had already completed their launch procedures, and their missiles were beyond recall. A salvo of R-36 heavy ICBMs rose from the Kazakh steppe into the night, arcing north over the pole toward a country that had done nothing. The war that neither side had started was now, in the most literal sense, in the air. NORAD saw them within minutes, and these launches were real. On the afternoon of September 25, Washington time, Ronald Reagan was given the warning American presidents had rehearsed for a generation. Soviet missiles inbound, roughly half an hour to decide. Almost simultaneously, a message arrived over the Moscow-Washington hotline, stark and nearly unbelievable. The launch was an accident, a false alarm compounded by error. No further missiles would follow. The Soviet Union begged the United States not to reply in full. In the underground conference rooms, the full war plan was on the table, thousands of warheads, prepared responses that assumed any Soviet launch meant total war. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger argued against it. A limited salvo aimed at missile fields, he said, matched with a hotline plea for restraint, was not a decapitation strike. Answering it with everything would guarantee the end of both nations to no purpose. Reagan withheld the full plan and waited out the longest half-hour of the century. The Soviet warheads fell across the northern plains, on Minuteman fields in Montana and North Dakota, on command sites hardened for exactly this moment. Tens of thousands of Americans died in the span of a few minutes, most of them without ever knowing a crisis had existed. And then came the decision that would define everything that followed. Reagan ordered a reply, but a measured one. A limited counterforce strike against the rocket divisions that had fired and the bases that supported them. An answer calibrated to punish without demanding escalation, holding Soviet cities and the Soviet leadership deliberately untouched. American warheads fell on the steppe, as Soviet warheads had fallen on the plains, and then, on both sides, the launch orders stopped. In Moscow, a shattered Politburo gathered around a man visibly dying. Andropov, collapsing under the strain of the night, faced the truth the hotline traffic now made undeniable. The war had begun with sunlight on clouds, with a censor error and a dutiful officer, and every further exchange would be fought over a mistake. The hardliners had no answer to that. Through the hotline, the Soviet Union accepted a ceasefire. The United States, its own missile fields burning, agreed. The Third World War lasted less than 1 day, killed hundreds of thousands, and was stopped, barely, by the same fragile human judgment that had failed to stop it from starting. The world that woke on September 27th was not the world of the day before. The casualties, hundreds of thousands dead on each side, the largest single-day loss of life either nation had ever suffered, were announced soberly and received with a horror that reshaped politics in both capitals. Because this time, there was no ambiguity to argue over. Both governments knew and eventually admitted that the exchange had begun with a false alarm. Launch on warning, the doctrine that had turned a reflection into a war, did not survive the year. Both powers dismantled it, accepted joint verification of each other's early warning data, American officers reading Soviet screens, Soviet officers reading American ones, and began the deep arms reductions that, in our timeline, would wait another decade. In the real September of 1983, none of this happened because one man broke his checklist. Stanislav Petrov looked at 5 missiles on a screen, decided that the end of the world would not announce itself so quietly, and reported a malfunction. His judgment stayed secret until the 1990s, when General Votintsev's memoirs revealed how close the margin had been. The lesson of this diverging timeline is not that the Soviet officers who might have acted differently were villains or fools. It is that they were ordinary professionals inside a system with no room for doubt, on a night when doubt was the only thing standing between a sunbeam and a war. The machinery was ready, the doctrine was ready. Peace, that night, was one man's hesitation, and history turned on whether the officer in the chair believed his screens or believed the silence beyond them.